Welcome. Thank you for coming, and good morning. And I know this is tough, last day of the conference. I really appreciate you making the effort to be here. I don't think you're gonna have a hard time staying awake because I have a lot of evidence here, and it's a really compelling story, in my opinion. And I'm hopefully we'll get some good dialogue here at the end as well. My name is Chad Harris, and my talk originally was called The History of Quantum Mechanics as it relates to the Jupiter-Uranus and Uranus-Pluto cycles. But it has evolved into the co-emergence of quantum mechanics and depth psychology as they correlate to the Jupiter-Uranus and Uranus-Pluto cycles. Now, I know that's kind of a handful. It's a little bit of a scientific paper, but we're going to get somewhere pretty different in the end. So just to let you know, I will post this as a PDF for the PowerPoint, so you will get all of the images. You don't need to take pictures. And I'd like to ask, were any of you in Rick Levine's quantum astrology talk? Okay, so 3 of you, a couple of you, okay. And how about Becca Tarnas's talk yesterday? 2, okay, great, 3, awesome. Oh, all right, sweet. So Rick Levine mentioned that in his talk that the universe disappeared with quantum mechanics. And Becca was mentioning how archetypes have an indeterminate nature. Now, Rick was being slightly facetious. The universe didn't actually disappear, but it is rendered 99.9% empty by quantum mechanics. Every molecule, every atom in our bodies is 99.9% empty, whereas like space itself is 95% empty. There's only 5% that's planets, dust, and objects out in space. But inside the atom, it is more empty than actually in outer space. So this is part of why he was mentioning that it disappeared. And there is an indeterminate nature to it as well, because the act of observation interferes with what we observe. So it's actually a co-creative participation that we are in when we do quantum mechanical measurements. So that is just a preface of how both of their talks kind of lead into what we're working on here. So I'm going to tell you a story, a narrative about how the analysis of light led to a new understanding of the nature of reality. Starting with Michael Faraday and James Maxwell's study of electromagnetism and the evolution of quantum mechanics and the standard model of particle physics, to the discovery of the Higgs field and how that chronology relates to the Jupiter-Uranus and Uranus-Pluto cycles. We will also explore some of the key developments in the history of depth psychology that led to the development of archetypal astrology, and we will conclude with a speculative exploration of C.G.Jung and Wolfgang Pauli's correspondence surrounding the desire for a neutral language informing both the psyche and physics. I have to contextualize this in the evolution of worldviews and the evolution of consciousness and ultimately the evolution of the astrological perspective. This is Richard Tarnas's mandala of evolution of worldviews, which he covered in depth in his talk yesterday. So I'm going to breeze through this. And basically what's happening is in the primal worldview, from prehistory up to about 10,000 BC, our sense of self was undifferentiated. That's why the porousness of the circle of the self here. And the blue lines are meaning and purpose. So there's meaning and purpose in the human being. There's meaning and purpose in the world. There's not as much of a differentiation at this point in the primal worldview. In the archaic, this is the first civilizations, 10,000 BC roughly. So we're just organizing the state. The pharaoh or the king is where the mediator to the transcendent of meaning. That's where the blue is. And then we move into the axial era, which is roughly the 6th century BC, and it's the only time in written history when Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were in a triple conjunction from 600 to 560 BC roughly. And the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, the beginning of the redaction of the Hebrew Bible in 586 BC, Thales and Pythagoras, all of these people existed around this time. And what happens is it moves from the pharaoh being the mediator to the transcendent to the upstart prophet, the individual, Socrates, Plato, Thales, Pythagoras, they all have their individual relationship to the transcendent.
I'm sorry, did you say 600 BC?
Correct.
Was that, okay.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And so then we move into the modern period, which really is defined by the Copernican revolution, where the human mind figured out something that all the religions didn't know. No other epistemic mode of understanding reality was able to reveal the truth that we were not the center of the universe. The human mind figured this out and it becomes inflated. It carves itself out. It thinks it's superior to the rest of nature, the world. This is where the secular age really dawns, because we feel as though we're superior. Then we move through the postmodern. This is also, Descartes comes in just after this and says, I think, therefore I am, and that's a subject-object division that's highly cauterized in this line here. So then we move into the postmodern, which everything is indeterminate. It's, we don't even know if we have meaning and purpose, let alone if there's meaning and purpose in the universe anymore. The modern scientific worldview or perspective says that there's not. It's a random accidental process that randomly, accidentally created a highly intelligent, meaning-seeking species out of a randomly evolving, meaningless universe. It's absolutely absurd. It is the predominant worldview. It doesn't make sense. This is where we can say the astrological perspective moves. So the beginning of astrology really, I mean, it's here too, but it's not, it doesn't have the same definition. But in the Archaic period, it's interesting, the word skole in Greek is where we get our word scholastic, and it means leisure. So it's like leisure time is what allowed for scholastic to take place. So it's, you get the city-state and you have leisure time for the priests, and they actually are able to figure out what's going on in the heavens. So you get the astrological omens, but it's just for the pharaoh or for the whole tribe. It's not for the individual. In 410 BC, this is when we have our first natal charts. So at the same time that the individual is making its new relationship to the whole, we have individual birth charts for the first time, at least in recorded evidence. So then we move into the modern with the Copernican revolution, and astrology is eclipsed in the same way that the religions are eclipsed in a sense. So we think we know, and we've disenchanted the cosmos, but what's happening is we're forging an autonomy. There's an individual differentiation that's taking place. Our sense of personal identity and sense of self comes from this differentiation period. And the authority or the confidence to challenge the Pope or challenge the King in the American and French revolutions comes directly from this confidence of being, of intelligence. So, but it's getting down here to where it's really kind of failing. So this is where Jung comes in and he says, since the stars have fallen from the heaven and our highest symbols have paled, a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have psychology today and why we speak of the unconscious. All of this would be quite superfluous in an age or culture that possessed symbols, like living symbols that connect us to the whole, and that's what we lost at the Copernican revolution. But now I want to break this down a little bit differently. So think about that whole evolution of humanity or the Western world as an individual human lifetime. So this would be infancy, where you're just completely dependent on nature. You can't even sit upright. Mother is, taking care of you completely. And then the pre-toddler, you're sit upright in the head. You can sit. You're trying to organize the bodily functions in the same way they're organizing the state. But then you get to the toddler position, and you have agency. You can move around. But mom is still, the transcendent. You're living in mimesis, like God created man in its image, and you're also she's relating to you as the center of the universe. Like you're the center of everything, in her mind, and she's a center for you too. But then you get through childhood and you go into adolescence, and often we figure out things that mom and dad don't know, and we kind of give them the finger and say, we figured this out, and sorry, we're going to take it from here. And that's a big part of what happened in the modern era. And you can also look at this as like the Campbellian rite of passage, like in the sense of moving through the postmodern, because the individual differentiates from the community of being and faces the dark night of the soul in the vast wilderness and like a 13 billion year old cosmos that has no meaning or purpose. And then we're facing our shadow that we've created in this large differentiation process. And potentially what I think may be happening is that the rite of passage moves us through to a new understanding where we can reconnect back to the symbols of meaning and purpose, which are the planetary archetypes. But really importantly, we get the math correct here, and then we discover Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which are essential for filling out the full depth of the human psyche, which actually evolved in this time period. It's the ascent of the differentiation of the self, of modern autonomy, that creates the giant shadow. Like Jung was saying, we've lost the symbols, and our symbols have become our neuroses, the gods have become our pathologies. So this is a big part of what's happening, but you have to have the math right, and you have to figure out that we get the 3 outer planets in order for the full picture to be realized. Not that it's completely full, but way more full than it was, and now we're a partner. We have an agency to move into relationship with the planetary archetypes, whereas before it was more they were just kind of coursing through us, and we didn't have the same agency as we do now. So that's just the basic background for this, and now we'll do a quick review of the planets. Jupiter is the largest planet in the solar system. It magnifies, elevates, and renders more visible any planetary archetype with which it aligns. It corresponds to the principle of growth and expansion and the incorporation of larger wholes with greater breadth of understanding and meaning. It relates to the principles of advancement, honor, ascendancy, and success. Jupiter also corresponds to birth and to the successful surmounting of thresholds. Uranus is the first planet discovered with the telescope, and the very act of its discovery overthrew an entire cosmology and relates to the principle of change, revolution, and novelty, to electricity and technological invention and innovation and experiment, to lightning-like flashes of insight, insight revelation, to speed and acceleration, to new beginnings and breakthroughs, to the Promethean fire of creativity and originality, and to genius. It also corresponds to sudden unexpected surprises, to radical disruption, to uncertainty, to the unpredictable, and to breakups of previously established authoritative structures or worldviews. Pluto was discovered in 1930 between World War I and World War II, just prior to the first nuclear disintegration, and corresponds to the principle of primordial power and intensity, to the underlying instinctual forces of nature, to the hidden realities beneath the surface of phenomena, matter, or the egoic persona, to transformation both destructive and regenerative. Pluto also relates to the massive elemental power within the atomic nucleus. Now, the Jupiter-Uranus combination correlates to peak experiences, revolutionary births and rebirths, to magnification and acceleration of experience and phenomena, to sudden unexpected epiphanies, to revolutionary record-breaking achievements, and instantaneous Uranus quantum leaps, Jupiter. Their average 14-month alignment periods tend to correspond to rapid advancement of scientific discovery and breakthrough insights that have the capacity to recontextualize standard assumptions of the time with altogether new understandings of reality. The Uranus-Pluto combination corresponds to the Uranian liberation of the Plutonic depths of both the psyche and of matter, to the Plutonic intensification of Uranian revolutionary energies for change and novelty. The average 12-year alignments correlate to sustained periods of emancipatory, revolutionary, and transformational phenomena that tend to accelerate technological innovations, scientific breakthroughs, and psychological transformations with powerful and radical cultural consequences. Does that basically make sense? So what we're going to do here, the methods that I'm going to be working with are the planetary aspects and the archetypal complexes associated with them. We're going to use 15 to 20 degree orbs for the world transits, 10 degree orbs for natal alignments, and 5 degree orbs for personal transits. I won't be referencing the signs or houses. It's just the mathematical structure of the solar system that we're working with here. So Isaac Newton, James Maxwell, and Albert Einstein are considered the three most important scientists of the modern era. And they are all born with Jupiter-Uranus alignments. Isaac Newton has Jupiter trine Uranus within 1 degree, both sextile to the Sun. James Maxwell has a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, trine to the Sun. He developed electromagnetism.
Wait a minute.
No, I'm sorry. You're going to get, I'll give you all the slides. Yeah, I'm going to give you a PDF of all the slides, so you don't have to take notes or anything. Just
How are we
let
getting
it sink in.
it?
I'll send it to UAC or I'll email it to you.
Okay, email.
Either way.
I
Yeah.
don't have them there.
Yeah. So yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. So James Maxwell, Sun, Jupiter-Uranus trine the Sun, and Albert Einstein has Jupiter opposite Uranus in a T-square with Pluto. So Michael Faraday, Albert Einstein on his wall of his desk, he had Newton, Maxwell, and Faraday on his wall. Faraday was one of the next most important scientists, discovered the electromagnetic induction, and he's born with Uranus opposite Pluto, and it's a mystic rectangle with Mercury and Saturn. So 2 trines, 2 oppositions, 2 sextiles, Mercury, Uranus, Saturn, and Pluto. And interestingly, James Maxwell is born 2 months prior to Faraday's discovery of electromagnetic induction, which he actually takes Faraday's work and uses it and combines called the Maxwell-Faraday equations that are the basic understanding of electromagnetism today. So when Faraday had this experience when he recognized electromagnetic induction, it was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction opposite his natal Uranus. So he's in his Uranus opposition with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. And we're going to see this again and again. Niels Bohr is the principal theorist for quantum mechanics. He's born with a Mercury, Uranus, Jupiter, Moon, Sun quintuple conjunction. It's also in a trine to Pluto. And he, like I said, a central theorist. We'll work on it later. Wolfgang Pauli. Okay, we could do a full lecture on him. Actually, this whole thing could be 2 semesters worth of stuff. But Wolfgang Pauli is one of the most fascinating physicists. He was considered the conscience of physics. Pauli was considered the conscience of physics by Bohr and Heisenberg. Most of the theorists of the old quantum theory would send their papers to Pauli for review before they would send them to be published. His criticism was often so sharp, he would often sign his reviews the scourge of Pauli or the terrible Pauli. When criticizing a paper that was not argued well, he was often known to say, "It's not even wrong." So at the age of 21, he wrote a 260-page review of Einstein's theory of general relativity that is still used today as a standard reference. Einstein had this to say about the review of his most far-reaching and complex work. "Whoever studies this mature and grandly composed work would not believe that the author is a man of 21. One does not know what to admire most: the psychological understanding of the evolution of ideas, the accuracy of mathematical deduction, the deep philosophical insight, the capacity for lucid, systematic presentation, the knowledge of literature, the factual completeness, the infallibility of criticism." This is Einstein talking about Pauli's review of general relativity. Okay? So, and when Einstein gave he won the Nobel Prize, and when Einstein gave the speech for him, he referred to Pauli as his spiritual son. And many of the physicists thought that he would take Einstein's place as the head scientist, but he ended up dying 3 years after Einstein from pancreatic cancer, 8 days after diagnosis, so that didn't happen. Pauli is also the physicist most closely born to the birth of quantum mechanics itself that I studied. So quantum mechanics was founded in 1900 in October, so he's the person born most closely to the actual birth of it. And he's well known for the mysterious synchronicities that often occurred when he would enter into experimental physics laboratories. He was a theoretical physicist, not an experimental physicist, and when he would go into laboratories, equipment would suddenly break. And it's called the Pauli effect. So all too often, for completely unknown reasons, laboratory equipment would suddenly break in his presence. He was born with a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction opposite Pluto, and what's interesting, it's in a T-square with the Moon. This is an accurate birth time. So the Pluto opposite Uranus and Jupiter, and a T-square with the Moon, which is on the descendant. So the Moon is the relational field, and it's on the descendant, and he's literally carrying these powerful synchronicities that are impacting his environment that he walks into. One more thing. Okay, so it was actually such a well-known and respected phenomenon amongst the physicists that many historians believe that Pauli was prevented from working on the Manhattan Project because of the synchronicities, because of the Pauli effect. There are writings where he's writing to Oppenheimer saying how lonely he is and stuff like that. So it's not completely definitive, but very likely is the case. So Carl von Mayen, it's a book called Writings on Physics and Philosophy, it's on Pauli, and he says, "Even quite practical experimental physicists were convinced that strange effects emanated from Pauli. It was believed that his mere presence in a laboratory produced all sorts of experimental mishaps. He, so to speak, tricked the objects. This was the Pauli effect. For this reason, his friend Otto Stern never let him into his laboratory. This is not a legend. I knew Pauli and Stern both very well. Pauli himself thoroughly believed in this effect. He once told me that he sensed the mischief already before as a disagreeable tension, and when the suspected misfortune actually hit, another one, he felt strangely liberated and lightened from the experience." So it says, "It is quite legitimate to understand the Pauli effect as synchronistic phenomenon as conceived by Jung." And another thing, I mentioned the conscience of physics. So like he has Sun exactly trine Saturn, and the Mercury-Mars conjunction is square to Saturn. So he's the conscience of physics, and he's the terrible Pauli, the scourge of Pauli, is a hypercritical Mars. You know, it's really all fits so well. So Louis de Broglie recognized that electrons, that matter actually is waving, not just light. And he's born with Uranus opposite Jupiter and Mercury in a square to Neptune. And this will become more interesting later. So Erwin Schrödinger is the principal theorist of wave mechanics. It's a backbone of the Copenhagen interpretation. He's born with Uranus trine Pluto and Neptune, and again, the wave mechanics. We'll see this. It's really fascinating. So Heisenberg came up with the uncertainty principle, and matrix mechanics, again, a backbone of the Copenhagen interpretation. Sun-Uranus conjunction opposite Pluto. Max Planck, the founder of quantum mechanics, born with Uranus, Mercury, and Jupiter in triple conjunction, Sun conjunct Pluto. Okay, William James, as one of the first psychologists, we're going to look at a couple of the important psychologists that lead to archetypal astrology. I am not that familiar with William James, but interestingly, he's born with Sun, Moon, Mercury square to Pluto, Sun sextile Uranus, and Jupiter is exactly square the midpoint of Uranus and Pluto, which is 5 degrees Aries, so 5 Capricorn is exactly the midpoint here, so it draws all of these together. Friedrich Nietzsche, the first self-proclaimed modern psychologist, born with a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, opposite Mercury, Sun opposite Pluto. Sigmund Freud, born just 12 years later after Nietzsche. They're both born in the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 1844 to 1856 period. Freud has the Sun conjunct Uranus and at the midpoint of Mercury and Pluto. You can also see he has Venus-Pluto conjunction. This is the lust and the libido focus of his psychology. And Carl Jung, born with the Sun-Uranus conjunction, square Moon-Pluto. So he's born at the end of the beginning of the Uranus-Pluto square of the 1870s, early 1880s, with the Sun and the Moon and Pluto. So Stanislav Grof is the premier LSD researcher in the world, and he's one of the co-founders of transpersonal psychology. He's born with Uranus in a T-square with Jupiter and Pluto and Saturn. And Richard Tarnas is, we all know, author of Cosmos and Psyche, and actually the founder of archetypal historiography, born with Sun, trine Uranus, and Mercury-Jupiter conjunction opposite Pluto. Now, these are examples that I'm not using. I have 2 pages of stuff that we're not going to use because I just don't have time to go through it. But Christian Huygens developed the mathematical theory of light. It's a wave theory, the first wave understanding, and this is a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 87. Then Newton came along and said, he split the light into the rainbow and said, no, it's corpuscular. He thought it was particle theory, or particle nature. So because Newton was a more established scientist, his theory reigned supreme until, Thomas Young had a thought experiment with the double slit. It wasn't real, it was a thought, it wasn't sound enough. But then Augustin Jean Fresnel actually gets light to diffract and proves that light is a wave, and it becomes the Fresnel-Huygens principle. But anyway, these all happen, Uranus, Pluto, Jupiter, Uranus, and then electromagnetism, all this stuff. Faraday, he gets it. There's lots of stuff I'm just leaving out. Now,
those are transits versus...
Yeah, well, both. These are mostly, these are all outer planetary alignments of Uranus and Pluto, or Jupiter and Uranus, that correlate to the time periods when those experiments took place. And then these are people who did experiments, either, if it says PT, it's a personal transit, otherwise it's just a collective transit. And the asterisk reference a Nobel Prize. So Röntgen discovers X-rays, Thomson discovers the electron. There's just a bunch here. We really just don't have time to go into it. It's really for a book. So Copernicus is born with Sun square Jupiter, Sun trine Uranus, and Sun opposite Pluto. And his Complementarity, which is the origin of the heliocentric theory, we know it was circulated amongst friends prior to 1514. Historians mainly believe that it was probably written between 1512 and 1513, which would have been during the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of April 1512 through February of 1514. And Galileo, born with Sun-Pluto conjunction, square Uranus and Neptune, on January 7th, 1610, points the telescope to the heavens and discovers the moons of Jupiter during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction opposite Uranus, just like we saw with Faraday and others. So this is the first evidence, like scientific evidence of the heliocentric theory. And Descartes comes in just afterwards, born with Sun, Uranus, Jupiter, Pluto, Mercury, Moon, quintuple conjunction, and publishes the Discourse on Method at his Uranus opposition during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, again, opposite his natal Uranus. This conjunction began in December of 1636 and didn't end until October of 1638. Yeah, so it actually had begun earlier than that. And this is a little wide, but it had been earlier. And so anyway, Maxwell develops the electromagnetic theory of field theory, and it's during a Jupiter-Uranus opposition that is on his sun. And Heinrich Hertz discovers the photoelectric effect. He is born, it's during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1885 through 1887. The experiments were conducted during this, and Uranus was opposite his natal Jupiter. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. Long waves here, then they get shorter. This is light, and it gets really tiny frequencies of high-end X-rays and stuff. We'll go into this in just a second. This is what it looks like. And what was happening up until quantum mechanics was there was Newtonian mechanics, and there was thermodynamics, like pressure, like steam, and mechanical forces. That was what they were working with in physics. And then they started to study light with electromagnetism. And what happens is it's called the ultraviolet catastrophe. What was taking place is that the wavelengths are super long here, and as the wavelengths would increase in frequency, they would get higher in temperature. All the way up until you get to visible light, to the ultraviolet spectrum. It's about 5,000 degrees. This is actually the temperature of the surface of the sun. But right at that point, it begins to cool off. And no one could understand why. The frequencies get shorter, but then instead of burning up in a giant ball of flame, which is what the classical math would predict, it doesn't do that. It cools off, and they didn't understand why. Planck was dealing with this problem for 6 years during his Uranus opposition, and then he proposed a radical hypothesis that there was a smallest integer by which the wavelength could be squared that would produce the correct result. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. It's called the Planck's constant. It's the smallest unit of energy, the smallest unit of measurement, and the smallest unit of time that we can understand. It's actually where the universe breaks down into granular discontinuousness. And he did this during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1900. Like I said, it was at the end of his Uranus opposition, which he had been laboring with the problem for 6 years during the Uranus opposition. So this is what classical physics would say about energy. It's this continuous stream and flow. But what happens is it breaks down into discontinuous relations at the small scale. And then Einstein takes Planck's quantum of action and the photoelectric effect and discovers the theory of special relativity, which is what proves that light has a constant speed and that it is the speed limit of the universe, and it recognizes the photon, or the particle nature of light. So up until this point, it was understood as a wave, and then Einstein recognized that it also has particle dimension. So Albert Hofmann, the discoverer, inventor of LSD, is born just the next year, Uranus-Mercury conjunction, opposite Neptune and opposite Pluto. Niels Bohr in 1913 discovered the model of the atom. So this is during his Uranus trine Uranus period. And what's interesting is this is what recognized the quantization of matter itself, of the distribution of the electron, distribution of the atomic energy. So, but he actually hypothesizes that the electron must know what shell it's jumping to in order to release the correct photon length of light. And this is actually still being debated, whether or not the electron actually knows anything, because in the double slit experiments, it actually behaves in a way that it seems that it's aware of our awareness of it. Like it changes its agency depending on the way that we measure it. So there seems to actually potentially be agency in the electron itself, possibly. We don't know, but possibly. And all the way back in 1913, Bohr hypothesized this possibility. Now, this is the periodic table of elements, and what you're looking at is the actual quantization of matter. These are the energy distributions of the electron orbital shells of each element. So you're actually seeing, like this is hydrogen, it only has 1 electron or 2 or something, and that's why it has so few. But these are literally the energy distributions. When you burn elements, they release exactly these spectral analysis, and they're specific fingerprints for each element. So you're actually looking at quantization in this image. Now there's several experiments that took place in the early 20s during the Uranus-Pluto trine that confirmed quantum mechanics and let them keep going till 1927 when it came really solidified as a science. But there's several of them. I'm not going to go through them. But what happened here with Compton, he won the Nobel Prize for it. His Uranus is 3 Scorpio, and this trine was in early water signs. It started in 1919, the experiments. This chart is from 1922 or 1923 at the end of the experiment. So all during the experiments, the Uranus trine Pluto was in a grand trine with his Jupiter. With his Uranus. And then when Jupiter came into it, that was the end of the experiments, and he ends up winning the Nobel Prize. Now, Wolfgang Pauli came up with the exclusion principle. This is what allows matter to be solid, like why this is not sinking through the table or why my hand doesn't go through. What's interesting, I mentioned before about Saturn and Uranus, he has Sun trine Saturn and Mercury Saturn. And then look, Saturn was opposing his Sun when he came up with, it's what allows for the stability of matter. Saturn, structure, matter, stability, all of that. He's got it strong in his natal chart, and he had it by transit when he came up with the theory. So Heisenberg develops matrix mechanics. It's one of the backbones of Copenhagen interpretation. It's at his Uranus square Uranus. It actually moves back to 21. So it's a 5-degree square Uranus. And de Broglie, this is fascinating, recognizes the wave nature of matter. Electrons, material world, everything like molecules, humans, planets are waving. They're both particles and waves. Like in Rick Levine's talk, he mentioned that he saw the planets as like low frequency electromagnetic waves. Well, it's true. I mean, I don't know what frequency, but they are. They're waving and they're particles. They're both. And we'll see an example of that in a second. But when de Broglie came up with this, look at what was happening. Neptune was conjoining his sun. Jupiter square Neptune. This is the wave nature. Neptune is the undifferentiated unity, the wave nature of matter. And he had it on his sun when he came up with it. Schrödinger, the other theorist of wave mechanics, again, Neptune on his sun during a Jupiter-Neptune opposition. Both of them theorize the wave nature of light and matter. This is the glyph for the Planck's constant. It's the reduced Planck's constant, but it looks a lot like Saturn, and it represents the smallest boundary or containment of scope that is possible for us to measure. This is the wave function. This is the Schrödinger wave function. In all of the scientific mathematical descriptions, this is what they use to symbolize that. And it represents the probability amplitude and the formlessness, the distribution of energy all around, rather than the pointed, which is the Saturnian. Right, deeply fascinating. Niels Bohr, this is the most important event, I think, in quantum mechanics. He recognizes called the principle of complementarity, and again, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction at his Uranus opposition. Jupiter-Uranus, even Mercury was there. What I think we can say about this, let me see if I'm, okay, yeah. Okay, the principle of complementarity states that the wave-particle duality is a complementary description of a single reality. Because we cannot fully know both wave and particle at the same time, thus there will always be an indeterminate dimension to reality. It also states that we cannot separate the measuring apparatus from the referent of observation. The instrument of observation must be considered as a part of the phenomena. So if we take that in and fully understand it, what it's saying is that we are a part of the measurement. You can't take us out. Like, the idea is that potentially we would be observers, not participants, but that's not the way quantum mechanics renders our understanding. So complementarity is helpful in explaining the fundamental intrinsic polarities and paradoxes in life. Why light and matter are composed of waves and particles, the inability to know position and momentum simultaneously, the inseparability of time and energy, or time and matter, electricity or magnetism, as well as the complementary nature of consciousness and what is unconscious, light and dark, good and evil, ecstasy and grief, the eternal and the temporal, the immanent and the transcendent, subject and object, psyche and matter, or psyche and cosmos. The principle of complementarity describes accurately the intrinsic interdependence between these phenomenological complementary descriptions of what are ultimately an inseparable or singular phenomena. So, like, we cannot understand what darkness is without light. It is impossible. You cannot understand what light is without darkness. They're complementary descriptions of a single phenomenon, a single reality. It's impossible to understand what they are without their complementary opposing forces. Wolfgang Pauli says this about it. He says, some physicists hope for a possibility for a return of the classical idea of the detached observer. This is what Einstein wanted. He wanted a detached observable position to know an objective universe. It's not what is rendered. Whose effect on the observed system could always be eliminated by theoretical determinal correction. So you could, like, do in mathematics that would understand what your influence would be on it. That's not what we can do. We can't actually do the math to correct for that. So he says, others with whom I belong, on the contrary, hopes in just the opposite direction, because what has impressed development on him in 1927 eventually led to the establishment of present wave mechanics, is the fact that real pairs of opposites, like particle versus wave, or position versus momentum, or energy versus time, exist in physics, the contrast of which can only be overcome in a symmetrical way. This means that one member of the pair is never eliminated in favor of the other, but both are taken over into a new kind of physical law which expresses properly the complementary character of the contrast. Now, this is something like just an example of how wave and particle is both in light that we use. So, like, we wouldn't have cameras or microscopes or things where light comes in and diffracts through lenses without the wave nature of light. Microwaves and radios as well, because radio waves are long and microwaves heat things up that are with water. That's the same frequency. That's why it heats us up. But we would not have radiation therapy or X-rays or MRIs or ultrasound technology without the particle nature of light. So, like the X-ray, it's a particle that goes through you and collects the image afterwards, whereas the long waves are stopping and up against your skin. So does that kind of make sense? Like, there's literally a dual dimension to light, and both are necessary in the macro world for these things to exist. It's not just the micro world that we're talking about. These are actual evidence in the macro world for what's happening here. So I'm going to play a little bit of this clip that'll talk about the diffraction nature of the material world.
What if particles could act like waves? As it turns out, they can. A few years after de Broglie published his hypothesis, diffraction, which is explicitly a wave behavior, was accidentally observed in electrons. Many years later, the famous double-slit experiment was performed. The setup involved a beam of electrons being fired at a barrier with two narrow slits. Particles would pass through these slits and impose their shapes onto the detector behind the barrier. Waves, on the other hand, would interfere. Some parts of the waves would combine to form larger peaks and troughs, while other parts of the waves would cancel each other out. In doing so, they would produce a distinct pattern on the detector, called an interference pattern. The areas with the most hits indicate regions where the waves combine. Empty areas represent the regions where the waves destroy each other. When electrons were fired through the double slit, an interference pattern emerged, indicating that they behaved like waves. Even when one electron was fired at a time, the interference pattern still emerged, thus making the duality of matter indisputable.
So, Richard Feynman says that that's impossible to understand classically. So don't be concerned that you don't quite understand it, because it's literally it's really challenging to understand. And they don't know if they really understand it yet fully. And there's actually a lot more to it. But what it represents is an entangled phenomenon. The particles are entangled, and that's what that diffraction, this is a diffraction pattern, and it represents entanglement. It's an entangled phenomenon. This will make more sense in a little bit. I'm going to skip through these. This is Stan Grof, and he's talking about us, like who we are, and the paradoxical nature of who we are.
We are fields of consciousness, transcending time and space, having no limitations, transcending linear causality. You can experience it in meditation, you can experience it in spiritual emergencies, you can experience it in the breathing, you can experience it under hypnosis, in the trance state, you can experience it when you take psychedelic sessions and so on. So what we have to do now, because we know those things are real, a person can be dying and consciousness detaches from the brain and they would go and perceive something in the other part of the building. Blind people can see in an out-of-body state and so on. So what we end up with is some kind of strange paradox, a paradoxical definition of who we are, and that definition will be very strangely similar to what physicists like Fred Wolf came up with in relation to subatomic matter and also light. And that is the wave-particle paradox. Subatomic matter is particles and waves at the same time. Light is photons or electromagnetic waves. In different experimental arrangements and the different circumstances, sometimes it's more appropriate to think about what you're seeing as photons. In some other experiments, it's more like light. And Niels Bohr, who tried to solve this paradox, came up with what's called complementarity principle. In order to understand what light is, what subatomic matter is, you have to simply accept a paradox. Those are two complementary aspects of the same phenomenon. And you, no matter what you do, you will not get what Einstein always wanted, which is a visualizable model. You can really pin it down. Say, what is it? I mean, a particle is occupying a certain space, has a certain momentum, has certain coordinates. Waves are spread all over the place. So, and your brain is saying, you know, is it a particle or is it a wave? It cannot be both. Only this is the best we can do.
Because it is both, and we are both. And you think about it, we're mortal beings, a particle, and our consciousness is waving. I mean, it disperses, it diffracts, it connects, it's Neptunian, and it's most likely eternal, whereas the body is mortal. But that's another philosophical discussion. So, in the end of the Uranus-Pluto square of the 1930s, Albert Hofmann synthesizes LSD on November 16th, 1938. Uranus trine the Sun, and the very next month, Otto Hahn has the first nuclear fission. So, nuclear fission. Otto Hahn's born 6 days before Einstein. Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto T-square. And Jupiter was conjoining Jupiter, and opposite Uranus. But the first nuclear fission leads directly to the atomic bomb. The creation of LSD leads to an atomic bomb in psychology. And it's a very interesting parallel, and it's been noted by other people as well. And 1964, Peter Higgs just hypothesized the Higgs field. This is what eventually gets discovered in 2012. John Bell comes up with a theory of non-locality, which is what actually proves entanglement. The first internet transmission takes place in 1969, Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto triple conjunction. I know that seems a little odd. It'll make sense in a second. Align aspect proves non-locality. He proves entanglement for the first time. He does it during a Jupiter-Uranus opposition, or he proposes his thesis, Jupiter-Uranus opposition in 1976. Then by the next conjunction, when Jupiter comes back around to conjoin Uranus, he publishes the experiments. But all that time, Uranus was moving across his natal Jupiter. And he conducted the first entanglement experiments and proved that it actually exists. And it sets the stage for all processive experiments for entanglement, which just recently, Chinese scientists teleported entangled photons 1,200 kilometers from Tibet to an orbiting satellite. It's the farthest distance that we've ever entangled anything. There's also a study, this woman did like hundreds of thousands of people playing video games. So they used human mind as random generators rather than actual random generators, because the human mind at that level is more random than actual random number generators. And it proved it again. It's another verification of entanglement. So Stanislav Grof and Richard Charnas discover transit astrology at that same time, that same Jupiter-Uranus opposition of 1976. And Stan Grof's transits were Jupiter conjoining Uranus, squaring his Pluto, Uranus trine to his natal Mercury and Sun, and Pluto square to natal Mercury, exactly. Richard Charnas had Uranus square Mercury, Uranus trine the Sun, and Uranus trine his natal Uranus, forming a grand trine here. So this is what's called the Livingston graph. It's a particle accelerators. It came out of the 1930s, and this is the energy the energy acceleration. And what happens is every 6 to 7 years, it multiplies by a factor of 10. Now, the axial alignments for Jupiter and Uranus are every 7 years. It's a 14-year conjunction, and every 7 years, the axials are the most potent alignments, the conjunction and the opposition. And then we see here that this continues to accelerate at that level, and it corresponds. I mean, even the first accelerated designs, all of these happen in the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1927. So this is Fermilab, just outside of Chicago here. It was opened in 1967, Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto triple conjunction. And in May of 76, that same Jupiter-Uranus opposition I was just talking about, it had the highest speed particle collisions, 500 giga-electron volts in 1976. Same year, 1976, the superproton synchrotron was put into place in CERN in Switzerland, and it discovers the W boson, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, at the next conjunction after 76 and 83, and the Z boson, same Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. These are really important for the standard model of particle physics. Back to the internet. In 1989, a physicist named Tim Berners-Lee, born with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in 1955, develops the protocol, the HTTP protocol for the World Wide Web, because the physicists at CERN were having a hard time mailing the data. The data was becoming so cumbersome that they were not able to mail it efficiently enough. And so he invents the World Wide Web in order for the physicists at CERN to share their information. It's literally where it came from. This is the Large Hadron Collider outside of CERN, Switzerland. This is the Geneva Airport. And this is 27 miles, it's 17 miles in diameter. And it was put into place in September of 2008 during the beginning of the Uranus square Pluto with a T-square with Saturn. It failed 2 weeks later, and just to remind you guys, this is when the financial collapse took place. 2 years later, they fixed it, March 30th of 2010, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, highest energy particle collisions ever, 7 tetra-electron volts. This is what allows them to discover the Higgs field. That is why they built the Large Hadron Collider. It is the largest, most complex machine humanity has ever invented, and they built it specifically to find the Higgs field. The Higgs field is a scalar zero field that allows all of the other elementary particles that interact with it to gain mass. That's why it was called the God particle. It's what allows things to actually gain matter. And interestingly, it's not only a Uranus square Pluto exactly, but it's a grand cross with the Sun and Saturn. And Saturn, meaning like Saturn here. It's like, that's what gravity, mass, again, matter, Saturn. So Peter Higgs, who hypothesized it, won the Nobel Prize at his Uranus return and Jupiter return. He had Jupiter return when he proposed the theory to begin with. So since then, just in 2015, we actually have had doubled the energy again, which is a little faster than the 7 years, but it's during this Uranus-Pluto square, and they don't have another machine, so they probably won't do 21 TeV another 7 years unless they figure out how to make this faster, but as of now, they probably won't. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. But this is a big part of what I want to say. So this is what we can look at as our archetypal historiography time waves. This is created by Kyle Leimetter. It's called the Archetypal Explorer program, and it actually you can get it online and it'll do your personal transits for you. It doesn't look like this, and actually it's in a beta form. It's gonna be better, and it'll actually do your personal transits. And Richard Tarnas wrote the interpretations for it. So you can get your personal transits, and it does it for you specifically. You can also look at world transits, but it'll be better. It's not quite finished yet, but anyway, in the future. And anyway, I think what we can see here is this is a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, and the events that happened, founding of quantum mechanics, the founding of depth psychology with the publication of the interpretation of dreams, Niels Bohr's model of the atom, the next conjunction. This is 1927 when all of it, the complementarity, uncertainty principle, the wave theory of electrons at the 5th Solvay Congress, when quantum mechanics was solidified as a legitimate scientific discipline. Now, what I think how we can see this is this is the Uranus-Pluto of the first half of the 20th century. All these things happened at the turn of the century, discovery of X-rays, all those things. These are the early 20s and the trine, the Compton experiment, Davison-German, all these were really important. This is the 30s, the discovery of LSD, nuclear fission, all the particle accelerators. And then the sextile, interestingly, Trinity and Hiroshima, which the sextile is really small, but it did happen then. The 60s, formulation of Bell's non-locality. Groff develops the perinatal matrices, which are really important for his cartography. The standard model of particle physics, the first internet transmission. Anyway, what I think we can recognize these as is like, this is the planets as particles, but as they interact with each other, they're waving. And these are probability density waves. I think we can see them as probability density waves in the same way the Schrodinger equation predicts the probability density for finding the electron. These are probability density waves for finding archetypal phenomenon. And I actually think it's an empirical tool. It's a lens that we can incorporate to understand ultimately how consciousness is participating in history, how it's participating in the archetypal complexes. Anyway, this is Karen Barad. She's a theoretical physicist who has studied Niels Bohr really deeply. And she says, indeed, recent studies of diffraction interference phenomena have provided insights about the nature of the entanglement of quantum states and have enabled physicists to test metaphysical ideas in the lab. So while it is true that diffraction apparatuses measure the effects of difference, even more profoundly, they highlight, exhibit, and make evident the entangled structure of the changing and contingent ontology of the world, including the ontology of knowing. In fact, diffraction not only brings the reality of entanglements to light, it is itself an entangled phenomenon. That's what I think this is. These are diffraction patterns, diffraction waveforms that are showing us the changing contingent ontology of our world. One dimension of it, anyway. So I'm going to skip that. This is Friedrich Nietzsche in his quest for humanity to reconnect with its roots that he felt like were severed by the Copernican revolution. He says, direct self-observation is not nearly sufficient for us to know ourselves. We need history, for the past flows on within us in 100 waves. And I think, again, this is what we can see, and we need history to understand who we are, how we're moving into our full becoming. And then this is just deeply fascinating. Okay, cool, I have 7 minutes. Okay, is that roughly clear? Yeah? Okay, great. Pauli says this, a type of statistical law that thus comes into being, one that is not reproducible by individual cases, which acts as a mediator between the discontinuum of individual cases and the continuum that can only be realized approximately in large-scale statistical framework, may be described as a statistical correspondence. That's, again, what I think we're seeing here, large-scale statistical analysis and statistical correspondence, because that's ultimately the way quantum mechanics describes the world as well, too, is statistical probability. It's not absolute. Like radioactive decay, it's all probability. It's within really fine ranges, but it's not in this absolute, predictable, concrete, determined reality. So the Jung-Pauli dialogue, Pauli and Jung carried on a 25-year in-depth correspondence in letters and in person. They collaborated on Jung's concept of synchronicity and were highly concerned with and discussed at length the psychophysical or mind-matter problem. Pauli's own words from 1952. He says, more and more I see the key to the whole spiritual situation of our time in the psychophysical problem. Another important point of focus was the conjunctio they believed could take place between humanity and an archetypal background or a transcendent source of meaning. They often describe this process in alchemical terms, moving from the 3 to the 4, or the trinity to the quaternity. Jung in 1953, in a letter to Pauli, said, oddly enough, the problem is still a 2,000-year-old one. How does one get from 3 to 4? Then Pauli, to Marie von Franz, says, the 2,000-year-old question, how does one succeed from 3 to 4? One can in no way succeed from 3 to 4, but I dare say one can arrive at 3 and 4 in various ways. My way is 2 by 6 to the zodiac, since what is older is always new. And it's interesting because he was resistant to Jung's incorporation of, well, he didn't resonate with Jung's astrological work in the monograph on synchronicity. It was like he was more skeptical of that aspect of it than any other aspect of the synchronicity monograph. But that was in 1948-49, and his thinking had evolved by 1953, and then even more by 1954. What in Descartes is split into extension and thinking is in Moore's dream split into 12 into 2 by 6. The split makes the quaternity impossible. The natural division of 12 would have been 3 by 4. This is also corresponding to the old division of the zodiac. So he'd kind of overcome the 2 by 6 and recognize that it's really the 3 to 4. And I don't understand this fully, the alchemy of 3 to 4, what all that means. It's something that's slightly new to me, but my understanding is basically the 4 is a sacred number, and it represents the transcendent and moving to that. And the 3 is just like the dynamics of our mechanistic world. And without the 4th, it's like the irrational that we haven't incorporated. We're solar and rational in our modern worldview, and we don't allow for the irrational, which is what the 4th number seems to indicate. So Harold Ottmansbacher is a physicist in Zurich who is a contemporary. He lives today, and he is doing research on this. He's actually called it the Jung-Pauli conjecture. So a more comprehensive typology of mind-matter correlations following from Pauli's and Jung's dual aspect monism was proposed by Ottmansbacher and Fock in 2013. They found a large body of empirical material concerning so-called exceptional experiences can be classified according to their deviation from the conventional reality model of a subject from the conventional relations between its components. Synchronicities in the sense of Pauli and Jung appear to be a special case of such relational deviations. He also says that if we take Pauli's views seriously, we have to reevaluate fundamental questions in natural science and ponder about the repressed concepts and the ideas in Western culture. Such a reevaluation involves cases like the psychological and the physical aspects of space and time, the old question of whether the psychic state of the observer can be correlated with external material course of nature, the problem of finality and its relation to chance, the role of meaning in the exact sciences, and the relation between inside and outside. So, can the psychic state of the observer be correlated with external material cause? I think that's what the astrological perspective demonstrates. And I actually think that it may help them in doing this research, because it seems as though they're trying to quantify synchronicities by exceptional deviations from the norm, but they don't have an empirical tool or lens from which to view these things upon. And I believe that the astrological worldview actually provides that on some level. So Ottmansbacher says the Pauli-Jung dialogue does not solve any of the issues indicated, any of the psychophysical issues indicated, but it helps to recognize a number of problems more clearly. In this sense, it might serve as a starting point to define a reasonable research program. Pauli. A complete quaternion worldview would not show up within physics alone, but it could well be related to the wholeness of physics and psychology. It would be conceivable, and even seems plausible to me, that there might be a phenomena for which the full quaternity plays an essential role. Again, I think the astrological perspective can help mediate this. This is Pauli to Marcus Fiertz. Says the question of the picture of God is very closely related to the other problem of the idea of reality. When he speaks of reality, the layman usually means something obvious and well known, whereas I think that the important and extremely difficult task of our time is to try and build up a fresh idea of reality. This is also what I mean when I continuously stress that science and religion must be connected in some way. I could call what I feel by the new idea of reality, by the way of trial, the idea of the reality of symbol. Now, the only thing I would kind of qualify this with is I don't believe that we're just trying to build up a fresh idea of reality. It's a discerning and building up. It's a co-creative process. We're rendering part of what's actually there, and we're co-creating the way that we experience it as well. So it's not just a matter of building up our own perception of it, it's a matter of distilling what is real and our understanding of it and our perception and co-creation of what that actually is. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I wanted to say, and I think that this is an image that kind of helps us get back to potentially recovering the living symbols that connect us to the transcendent through the archetypal astrological that wasn't possible before the last 2 or 3 years, actually 1930. I mean, before the discovery of Pluto, We don't understand the 60s. We don't understand the world wars. We don't understand so much about the depth of the human psyche. This is literally a new worldview that wasn't possible until the forging of the autonomous self and the discovery of the 3 outer planets that mirror the depth of who we've become. Maybe we'll end it there and take questions, yeah?
Very hard, very hard.
Very hard?
Yeah. But
yeah, it was
I'd
a
like,
lot.
yeah, but I would like the PDFs if I could. Do you have
Absolutely.
a business card or anything like
Sure, I
that?
have a couple of cards up here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's my email's not on there, but it's astrology at Archetypal View.
Oh, wait a
Sorry,
minute.
I made these like right before I came because I don't have them normally. But it's
What is it?
It's astrology at Archetypal View.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
the
yeah.
actual.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Chad, can I ask you a question?
Please, yeah. I'd love.
So, that rite of passage
Uh-huh.
that you talked about with
Yeah.
that progression,
Mhm.
I know in some cultures, kind of maybe pre-industrial cultures, there was oftentimes a rite of passage around or just after adolescence
Mhm.
in terms of the individual becoming kind of a functioning member of the society.
Exactly.
And I know in the Groff framework, the Groff-Tarnas framework of perinatal matrices corresponding with outer planets, you begin with a kind of a Neptunian state, which looks like that self state where it's
Right.
like it's all unified.
Yep.
And then there's possibly a progression back to a Neptunian state through the birth process.
Correct.
So is that, like, when you say rite of passage, are you kind of saying that there's a process that we're going through now that's bringing us back, it's either bringing us into a mature kind of place and back to a kind of
Yes.
a reiteration of
Yes.
that Neptunian?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because that's what the planetary archetypes do. They are the archetypal Neptunian, enchanted, meaningful cosmos. And we are reconnecting back to it, but after we've differentiated. And we had to eclipse it on some level. We had to suppress it because before it was like the gods were speaking through us, and that's not what we have today. But ultimately, I think this is about the individuation of humanity. Like, all of the human species is differentiating into an autonomous individual nature of being that can now reconnect back to a meaningful cosmos and recognize their place, like you're saying in the rite of passage. That's what you recognize your gifts. You face your shadow, you see your shadow, but you also recognize your talents and how you can come back into the whole, how you can be a part of the community and reintegrate and recognize yourself as a part of not only the intimate community, but the cosmic community. You're no longer separate from any of it. Please.
I see synchronicity as a conjunction of the physical world and consciousness, and I'm just wondering, where do you see, I mean, this is kind of pointing in that direction. I agree with that 100%. And, you're a young guy, I'm an older guy, and where do you see all this going?
I believe that what this indicates is that there's an intelligence in the universe that wants to have a dialogue with us. It's forging a relationship. That's why we've become That's why we become individuated, and the synchronicities are the intelligence of the universe speaking to us, and they correspond to our transits. Often, like where you make a decision at a certain point, and then you'll see the consequences of that in symbol and synchronicities in your life, and that is the intelligence in the universe actually speaking to you and trying to develop a dialogue so you can actually have a relationship with the deeper parts of yourself and the cosmic will, in some sense, or like how you can maybe move into your highest potential related to what the symbols and synchronicities of your life are showing back to you relative to the decisions you've made and that type of thing. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Hold on just a second, please.
I have a couple of observations. You were moving very fast through a lot of the
Yes.
presentation,
Sorry
so
about that.
it was hard for me to see, but I did notice a little bit, and I was curious. It seemed like when there was Uranus, Jupiter aspects, the idea would come in. And then when there was Uranus-Pluto aspects, it would be made manifest. That was just a quick observation and just whatever I could catch visually. And I was just wondering if that was the case, if that had been looked at, just to determine is that kind of how it flows.
Well, the Jupiter-Uranus time periods are a lot shorter. They're only 14 months or so. The Uranus-Pluto periods are like 12 years. So there's a lot more time for the manifestation to happen. There is something to what you're saying in that Pluto represents transformation and Uranus technological, and you do see like tremendous technological like periods where all sorts of energy things are developed in that time. But there are physical things also developed and breakthroughs with Jupiter-Uranus as well. It's not just ideas. I do see what you're saying. There are lots of ideas.
I know that there are,
Yeah.
but it just, like I said, you went so fast, but just what made impression upon me seemed to give the indicator that it was like the Jupiter-Uranus transits were triggering the expansive idea,
Yes.
or the next leap forward.
Yeah, definitely.
And then the Uranus-Pluto was like, okay, now the foundational ground that has been created from the previous idea is now being shaken up.
Yes,
So that was the impression.
I can definitely resonate with that. Yes.
And then to the second part of that is, I wondered if there was any research done and correlating, okay, again, the Uranus-Jupiter or the Uranus-Pluto to now in its conjunction or opposition to the next trine. Because we know that in astrological natal work, that what happens at the conjunction, what happens at the opposition, that the conjunction when it comes into the trine as an opportunity for integration. So I was just curious if there had been any research on that.
Yeah, not a whole lot. I worked with the trine of the 20s, where a lot of the quantum experiments were done to actually validate it, that came into being, that actually made it real. Because prior to that, they didn't have the experimental techniques to actually prove the theories that they were coming up with. So yeah, in that sense, they were manifested during the trine. Exactly.
So I would say that would carry forward.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
It's just a question of researching to prove that in fact was the
Agreed.
case.
Yes, and it's going to be really interesting to see in the trine that follows our present square that begins in the early 2020s.
Right, because we have Uranus coming up trine.
Exactly, like what,
That's why I asked the question.
yes, like how this manifests. I mean, because like quantum computing is manifested during the current Uranus square Pluto decade. Like this is when quantum computing has come into potential existence. And to see where it's going to manifest by 2020 will be really deeply fascinating. I also am intrigued by what's come out of our astrological worldview in the last decade as well, and how that is going to manifest. One thing that Ottmansbacher talks about is how the mind-body problem, like in the 90s, was the decade of the brain, but they didn't figure out consciousness, and they're probably not going to. But this is actually an empirical model that references how consciousness participates in history. And it actually, like you can look into Freud's birth chart and you can actually get a little bit of an understanding of his first-person experience. This is part of what the mind-body problem is about. First-person experience versus third-person experience. And there's a way in which, like you can see in the Trump psyche, and you can see why he's thinking certain things the way he's thinking at that time relative to his transits. This is access into the first-person experience that is not provided in any other method that I'm aware of. Do you have a question?
Yes. You have the question marks in the rite of passage. Every culture had a defined rite of passage that you went through to become an adult. We've lost that. Do you think we need to recreate something?
Yes, I mean, like I was lucky to experience the psychedelic rite of passage in my late teens, and I do think that we are also, I mean, psychedelics are becoming more recognized for their value, and they do and have been recognized as a big part of indigenous cultures, rite of passage for their. But yes, I do think we need to develop more of that. It's like Groff has this interesting quote. He says we're in a race, like what is it, catastrophe versus
Transformation.
transformation. You know, it's like we have to do this or else we're not going to make it. And it's a big part of why the reason we're destroying the planet, or our ability to survive on it, is in large part because of the subject-object division.
I was born on August 13th, 1947, the Roswell incident.
Wow.
The year the transistor was invented at Bell Labs.
Oh, wow.
21 years later, Bell Labs, the microchip.
Mm-hmm.
And then 21 years, or 22 years later, the light computer was invented. They haven't even brought that out.
Interesting. Yeah, Bell Labs is also where they did the first entanglement experiments, I believe. So, actually, wait, James.
Yeah, go ahead.
On a more practical level, I have a question about the slides, which I really love, the image of where you have the different times of the discoveries, and then you have the blue, like an interference pattern.
Oh, right,
and
right.
They were labeled, general things like Uranus square,
Right.
like those things. Exactly, exactly. So my question is, the blue lines with the spikes on the top, like say the middle one, it says Uranus sextile Pluto. So,
sorry.
Right.
Yes.
yeah, that one right there, just as an example.
Right.
The blue shaded area is whenever Uranus sextile Pluto was in orb.
Correct.
And the peaks are the exact or
Exactly.
closer
Yes.
orbs.
That's exactly
Okay,
right.
so-
These are the orbs here, and this is the time here.
Okay, see, I can see the numbers on the left, but
Yeah.
it wasn't labeled orb,
Yes.
because, the slide's not big enough.
Yeah, thank you. And
Okay.
I should have mentioned that. That's exactly right. The higher it is here, the more exact the alignment, and the width is the length of the duration of the
Okay.
orb of influence.
As astrologers, we all probably figured that out, but I just wanted to be clear that, you
Yes.
weren't doing something else.
And I appreciate your clarification on that. It's really important. Sorry I went so fast. But
Well, there's a lot of information here. You had to go fast.
it's kind
And
of true.
Jupiter-Uranus.
And my Mercury is 0 Taurus, so Uranus is right on it right now. So it's
Okay.
a little bit fast, but did you have another question?
So I was just thinking that I tend to think of Uranus as it relates to the collective as like, the idea coming down and the individual being the transmitter that can receive. And so what was being said before about ritual, the importance of rites of passage. And my thought is that, with Uranus moving into Taurus, and in aspect to the Capricorn, Saturn, Pluto, that we could very well begin to see maybe a little bit more of a discovery. I mean, more and more states are now legalizing medical marijuana. And so, and as always with mankind, it has to come through the mind, the logic, in order to be able to begin to open up. So there could very well be a possibility of, the LSD or medical marijuana coming into a little bit wider acceptance. And then to piggyback on that, it seems to me that what you were saying about that astrology does give us the model with which to approach the understanding of consciousness, is that it seems like the scientists have to come to the become secure within themselves that they can figure it out before they'll let us have access.
Right, it does seem
from the
that
way
way.
they see it.
Right.
Since it takes so long before these theories get into the school books, before the college students or even have access to them to even do thesis, which, how long does that take before the high schooler gets it and the preschooler and so
Right,
on?
right.
So,
Yeah, it's a great points. It's also interesting that LSD was made illegal in '66 during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, but it was when Saturn was opposing it. So Saturn brought the authority, suppressed it.
Totally.
Yeah, so it's interesting now there is the trine. There's Uranus square Pluto, but there's a Uranus trine Saturn, and there's more of this harmonious bridging between the past and the authorities and the psychedelic countercultural movement and all that. So yeah, I'm very
Great.
hopeful. as well.
Show your email address.
Yes.
Yes,
please.
your
Yeah,
email.
sure. Yeah, sorry, it's so small.
Oh.
It's astrology@archetypalview.com. Yes, please.
I've done a lot of research over the years between synastry and transits, and a lot of what you're saying I totally resonate with, and studying synchronicities and everything. So like, you you having this lecture just blows my mind, because I have a hard time, because I know that this is happening from my own observations, but it's hard to get any scientists to look into it,
Right.
you know?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank
So
you
I
so much.
appreciate this
No, you're very
lecture.
welcome. It's an honor. It's a real honor to be here.
Thank you.
Thank